You're listening to the Co-Creator Network. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Good afternoon, and welcome back to Limitless Living Radio, a program dedicated to helping people create and live the best life they can, regardless of their age, where they are in life, their personal circumstances, or what they have or they don't have. My name is Judith Albright, and my co-host is Barb Adams. I'm a stress management specialist, and for the past 8 years, I've had a private practice in Fort Collins, Colorado. Barb is the host of a popular 3-hour radio show entitled American Now that is broadcast every week on Saturday night at 9 p.m. on the Genesis radio network. So last week we talked about what it meant to live a limitless life and all the things that prevent us from having it. And we know that we're really the victims of our own selves and our own self-limitation. And it is we ourselves who actually determine what we can have and what we can't have. And just to go over a little bit about what we said in the last show, there's basically 3 reasons why we don't get what we want out of life. And the first one is knowing what we want. The second one is believing you can achieve it. And finally, the third one is allowing yourself to have it. But even if you know what you want, believe you can achieve it, and are willing to allow yourself to have it, you still need some tools to help you do that. Because changing your beliefs and thinking patterns is something that is kind of hard for us to do for ourselves. You know, there are many self-help books out there that say simply change your mind, but we really know that that's easier said than done. It's just not enough to simply declare that you've changed your mind about something, because if it's not changed at the subconscious level, then nothing is very likely to change. So how do you do that? Well, people say that it takes 21 days to make or break a habit. And that means that if we're going to get rid of a habit or create a new one, you have to do something consistently for 21 days. But how many of us have the discipline and the time to do that? And there are much easier ways to do that, and that's what we want to talk about on our program today.
Judy, how can we get a reading on what the subconscious mind actually believes, though? How can we know what we really believe?
Well, there's a wonderful tool called muscle testing. That is a key part of a lot of this healing, and it's certainly a key part of all the modalities that I use in my practice.
So what actually is muscle testing? How do you do it? And what's the history behind muscle testing, Judy?
Okay, well, it's basically a way of communicating with the subconscious mind using the body, the muscle strength of a part of the body to do that. And it's been around for a while. It was actually introduced into the United States in 1964 by Dr. George Goodhart, who is a well-known chiropractor who had a practice for years in Detroit. And it was back in the 1960s that Dr. Goodhart discovered that muscle strength was a good way to communicate with the mind and body, and he was one of the first to use the body as a diagnostic tool. And in fact, he's known as the father of applied kinesiology. Then in 1982, his work was taken up by Dr. John Diamond, who was his friend and collaborator, and he carried on Dr. Goodhart's work even more. Now, Dr. Goodhart is deceased, but Dr. Diamond is still around. He's actually a medical doctor and the author of several books, including Your Body Doesn't Lie. Now, Dr. Diamond is an Aussie. He was born in Australia and graduated from the Sydney Medical School in 1957. And today he is a fellow of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. He's a foundation member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the American Holistic Medical Association, and he's still practicing in New York City as a consultant. Well, since that early pioneering work, muscle testing has pretty much become a common practice with practitioners of complementary medicine and alternative healing, but more and more medical professionals, such as those that deal with allergies and nutrition, are using it more and more. And it's certainly the backbone of the work that I do. And though other muscles can be used, we can actually use any muscle in the body. The most common one that we use is the arm and the shoulder muscle. It's one of the biggest muscles, one of the strongest muscles in the body, and probably the most convenient to use.
So how does it work?
Well, it's very interesting how it works, because we have someone that we're trying to muscle test stand, and they extend their arm out, to the side of their body, straight out, horizontal. And the first thing we have to do is to establish communication between the subconscious mind and the conscious so that we know what a yes answer is and what a no answer is. And so we do that by making a statement that we all know is true, such as my name is, or I live in, what have you. And then we have the person resist. Now, if the statement is true, the arm and shoulder will remain steady, even if we really press down hard on it. But if it's untrue, if the statement is not true, the arm will weaken and drop with very little pressure on it, and it has absolutely nothing to do with strength. It has to do with the strength of the signal between the brain and the muscle. And here's what's happening. The mind is, remember, it's a computer, and what is happening is that the mind is searching through all of its little cubby holes for something to verify or deny the statement. And if it doesn't find anything relevant, it sends a weak signal. But if it does find it, it says, yes, I believe that that's true, your name is whatever, and it sends a strong statement, or a strong signal, and the muscle stays strong.
So, Judy, of all the modalities that you use, what are the tools? What are the main tools that you use? Okay, well, I use three different things. EFT, Emotional Freedom Techniques, Psych-K, and the Emotion Code. And I'll start out by talking about EFT because that's what I started out to begin with. And it's been around for a while, too. You know, back in the 80s, there seemed to be a resurgence or a new energy coming forth about these kinds of things. And a whole lot of things came to light at that time, one of which was the work of Dr. Roger Callahan, who originated thought field therapy, or TFT. And he's a clinical psychologist, and his work is based on specific algorithms. Then in 1995, Gary Craig came along, and Gary was trained as an engineer at Stanford University, and he took a look at thought field therapy and said, I think I can do something different with this. And so he ended up buying the technology from Dr. Callahan and came up with what we now know as EFT, or Emotional Freedom Techniques. Now, there's two aspects to the human body. There's the chemical and the energetic. Now, doctors are what work on the chemical part of us. That's the physical part of us. And then the second part of us is the energetic part, and that's what EFT works on. It works on the body's energy field. And EFT is an interesting combination of psychotherapy and Einstein's theory about energy. Because we know that back in the 1920s, Einstein put forth his theory that everything is comprised of energy, and humans are certainly not any exception to that. We are electrical beings. And we know that because if you ever walked across the carpet and touched the light switch and they got stung by static electricity. And then if you think about it, if the body was not electrical, we couldn't have CAT scans and brain scans and cardiograms and all these other things. So really, to understand how EFT works, we have to understand the body's energy system, because it's energy that allows our brain to communicate with the body. Because without the flow of energy, we wouldn't be able to see, hear, feel, taste. And when you get right down to it, without the flow of energy, we are not living, because it's the life force within us. Now, Gary's idea on EFT was that 85% of all physical ailments are caused by a disruption in the body's energy system. And he compares it to an overload of the electrical system in our house, because we know that if we overload the circuits in the kitchen, the breaker flips, and the stove won't cook, the fridge won't cool, nothing works in the kitchen. And so just like having to reset the breaker switch, this is how EFT works. It really resets the circuits in our mind and body. And it works by stimulating 10 acupuncture meridians on the head and the upper body by tapping on them with the fingers. And tapping, what it does is stimulates and amplifies the flow of energy between these meridians. They're like little telephone poles, and they conduct energy from one to the other. And what this does is it relaxes the body, and it tunes the subconscious to a unique state of receptivity. So what happens is that tapping, combined with carefully crafted patterns of words and phrases, which we're going to talk about more in a minute,
those words reach the subconscious on a very deep level, which is what allows us to make some really unusual changes. And it works, EFT works just the same as your body's national defense system, only on your energy field. Because we know that when a foreign body enters the body, the first thing that happens is the body tries to throw it off. And it's like having a splinter in your finger. You know, your body, it will get infected and it will start festering and the body tries to throw it off. Well, the body also tries to throw off negative energy stored in the emotional DNA, and if it can't find a healthy way to do that, the result is very often emotional and physical ailments. And we know there's lots of stuff written about that, about how emotion can come out as physical ailments. So I like to compare EFT to a pressure cooker because it's like that little valve that sits on top of the cooker that lets the steam off easily. Because when the heat is on, the steam inside that pot builds up to a pressure point, and that little valve on top goes back and forth, allowing, you know, a controlled release of the steam within. And if it gets stopped up or something happens to it, the pressure builds up in the pot and it blows. And I remember as a little kid watching my mother crying in the kitchen because she blew up a pot of beans, and they were all hanging from the ceilings, and so she was not a happy person about that. So that's how EFT works. It's like that little valve. It allows us to release the steam without letting us blow. And so there's two parts to EFT. We've talked about tapping, which is very easy. It's the same for practically everything. But the more important part is what we say while we're doing the tapping. How many people have heard, I mean, we've all heard that, you know, fake it till you make it. But that doesn't always work, because if you're trying to tell your subconscious mind something that is not believing, it's going to fight you. It creates cognitive dissonance. And so we have to come up with a particular way of crafting a phrase, because a regular affirmation is something like, oh, I am happy, healthy, and wealthy. And your subconscious mind is going to rear up and say, are you kidding? You just got out of the hospital. You have 2 broken legs. You don't know how you're going to make your next car payment, and your spouse just ran off with your best friend. So don't tell me you're happy, healthy, and wealthy. So to get around that, we have to acknowledge what is, because the subconscious is very literal. And so what we have to do is tell it like it is. And so we start every phrase with even though, acknowledging. So a way that we would say an EFT affirmation as opposed to a regular one would be, even though I just got out of the hospital, I have 2 broken legs, blah, 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 I choose to be happy, healthy, and wealthy. And the subconscious doesn't fight that, because it says, okay, you can choose whatever you want and I'll help you. So that's the difference. There's 2 types of affirmations that we use, and this goes back again to Dr. Callahan and Gary Craig. And the default phrase is self-acceptance. You know, in spite of whatever's going on in my life, I deeply and completely accept myself anyway. Because we have to give ourselves a break here. We're human beings. We're doing the best we can. And so we are kind of cutting ourselves some slack here. So the most effective way to get emotional intensity down with something is to use this default phrase of, I deeply love and accept myself anyway. Then the other kind is something that's new that came up in recent years that was developed by Dr. Patricia Carrington, and that's known as choices. And choices is a reframe. So in spite of whatever's going on in my life, I now choose to have or do or be this or that. And it acts just like the find and replace feature in Microsoft Word. You know, find and replace, we're going to find this and replace it with that. And that's the second kind of affirmation.
So, Judy, though, how do you know if EFT is actually working? And how do you know when to quit using it?
Okay, that's a really easy answer, because for any issue that we're dealing with, we measure the intensity of it on a scale of 1 to 10, meaning that 1 or 0 is we're not having any reaction at all, and 10 being I'm having a nuclear meltdown about it. So our goal is to keep tapping with various words and phrases until the intensity level is at 0, or at least a 1 or a 2. So how do we know that that's happening? Well, first of all, the emotional intensity is gone. You can't remember why you were upset. You can't necessarily recreate how you felt in your mind. And you stop thinking about whatever was bothering you. And that's how we know, is that our goal is to get something to zero. So really to explain to you how this works, I'd like to tell a little story here, because tapping is incredibly effective for dealing with fears and phobias. And I'd like to just talk briefly about a young man who came to me with an absolute phobic fear of flying. And his mother and dad gave him a 6-week paid vacation in Europe as a graduation present from college. And he really wanted to do this, but even the thought of getting on a plane made him absolutely physically ill. In fact, if he was in the car driving to the airport, and the minute he saw the airport's towers, he started throwing up. So this was really extreme. So I used a technique with EFT known as telling the story, which is what I did was I walked him through this whole process, because interestingly enough, the mind doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. So we did a walking visualization, and every time that we hit a place where he was experiencing any intensity at all, we stopped and tapped until he was at a 0. And so what I did was I had him close his eyes, and we walked through the whole thing from the time that he put his clothes in the suitcase, he got in the car, they started driving to the airport, and sure enough, he started getting panicky when he saw the airport tower. So we stopped and we tapped on that, and then we went on, and we visualized going into the airport, parking the car, getting out, going into the terminal. And this was back in the days when we used to have ticket agents. There was actually somebody there, to check you in. And so his next point of intensity was when we walked up to the ticket counter. And what triggered him was seeing his bag with that tag on it going away from him down the conveyor belts. Because then he's thinking, oh my gosh, I'm stuck now because they got my stuff and I've got to get on. So we tapped through that. We ended up going through security, and at our airport there's a train. So we got on the train, we went out to the concourse, and his next sticking point was at the gate when he had to hand over his boarding pass to the ticket agent. And he freaked out about that because he knew that once he handed over that boarding pass and got in that walkway to the plane, that he was making a one-way trip on, most likely. So he panicked about that. We got rid of that. And then the most amazing thing happened was that when he got into that walkway, that metal thing that connects the plane to the building, he really freaked out in there. And I said, what is it that's triggering you? And he said, the noise. And I said, what noise? Thinking maybe it was the engines on the other side of him, I said, is it the jet engines revving up on either side of you? No. Is it the people talking? No. And he says, it's the noise of the feet. And what he was hearing, and I never heard this before, but now I never get on a plane that I don't think about this. It doesn't bother me, but I hear it now. And it was the sound of people walking on that metal walkway that was going like a wonk, a wonk, a wonk, because it creates a vibratory noise, and that was really scaring him. So we had to get rid of the noise in that metal walkway. Then we got him on the plane, and he had a little nervousness getting his bag into the upper cupboard there, the bin. And he was all right until the pilot started the engines, and they started to push back, and so we tapped through that. And then predictably so, he got pretty frightened when they got on the runway and they started taking off, because, I think all of us, whether we have a fear of flying or not, our ears are tuned to the nuances of those engines. And so when the pilot thrust that stick forward and those engines roared into life, of course, that scared him. So we had to work on the different nuances of the engines. Then, of course, we're up in the air now. And fear of flying is a very, very complicated fear. It's not just one single fear. It can be a lot of things. It can be fear of heights, claustrophobia, not being able to breathe, feeling trapped, feeling that your life is in someone else's hands and you can't do a thing about it. And there's two things that will really trigger somebody, even if they're doing okay. There's two things that will trigger somebody in the middle of a flight. The first one, of course, is turbulence, and the other thing is children screaming. Well, fortunately, children screaming was not the issue for him. It was, of course, the turbulence. So we tapped on the turbulence. He was okay until the plane started to go down, and then he started fearing that they were going to crash, so we got rid of that. And finally, we got him on the ground. And so I made him go back through this whole scenario in his mind, and I said, is there any place at all where you have any anxiety at all? And he said, no. So he went on his merry way, and I thought, well, I hope this works out well. And a while later, his mother called me, and she said, I don't know what you did, but it's a miracle because he got on that plane. He went to Europe. He had a grand time on the plane. There was no fear. And he even bought some extra plane tickets to fly between places in Europe. So that's an example of how you use EFT to tap down something like that.
Judy, that's an amazing story, too, because actually what you're talking about here is you did this all with him not being on the plane or actually going through this.
That's right.
It was because basically in the imagination, as you say, we can't tell the difference.
Exactly. Yes.
What about Psych K? How does that work?
Well, that's a completely different modality. Now, if somebody's really upset emotionally, we're going to start out with EFT because that's what will, take the emotional charge out of something. We can't change things. What we can do is change how we react to it. And Psych K is completely different. It too works on the subconscious mind, but in an entirely different way. And it's been around since 1988. It hasn't been really well known until Dr. Bruce Lipton wrote about it in the last chapter of his book, The Biology of Belief. And Dr. Lipton has become a friend of Rob Williams, who's the creator of this, and he's an avid supporter of Psych K and what it can accomplish. And we have to go back to the subconscious mind again, because last week we talked about what we are, what we believe. But we only have access to about 10% of our mind. The other 90% is what really controls our life, but it's walled off from our conscious mind because we don't even know what's programming us in there. So what we do with Psych K is we use muscle testing to identify the negative beliefs and the thought patterns, and then we change them by what we call a balance. And we refer to this process as a balance because there's an imbalance between the conscious and the subconscious mind. The two are actually working against each other, and the subconscious always wins. It's like having two horses hitched to a wagon. One is going one way and the other is going the other, and they are pulling against each other, and that wagon isn't going anywhere. It's stuck. So our goal with Psych K is to get both parts of the mind working together. And again, we use muscle testing to determine what we believe, and then what a balance is. It's a whole brain integration process that changes a negative belief to a positive one. And how it works is like having something recorded on a tape, and you stick the tape in the tape recorder and you hit the button and you record. And when you finish recording, you have effectively overwritten what was on the tape originally. And so when we do a balance like that for a negative belief or a thought pattern, we are literally overriding it with a positive one. And that's how we can change a negative to a positive. Now, last fall, I had a very wonderful experience because I participated in an international Psych K conference. And participating in this conference and conducting it was Rob Williams, whom I said was the originator of Psych K, and Dr. Jeffrey Fannin. Now, Rob is a psychotherapist, and he's also the author of the book, The Missing Piece, spelled P-E-A-C-E. Now, Dr. Fannin is he's board certified in neuropathy. No, excuse me, not neuropathy, neurotherapy. I always confuse those two. Neurotherapy. And he's the executive director for the Center of Cognitive Enhancement in California. And he has built his whole practice on mapping and analyzing the brain and training it for optimal health and performance. And he does brain mapping. And during this conference, Dr. Fannin presented us with slides that definitely show the difference in brain activity before and after a Psych K balance. And it was amazing to see this because before we had to take it on faith, and now we can see it on slides, the difference in the brainwaves before and after these balances. So to illustrate how Psych K works, this is a different situation because, again, we're working on a belief system and not somebody's emotion necessarily. And the best way I can illustrate this is to tell you another story about a client a few summers ago who came to me for some different issues, and she was very proud of herself. At that time, she was feeling really good about herself personally because she'd lost a lot of weight, and she bought some new clothes, and, you know, she looked really good in them and felt good in them, and she was so pleased to feel good about herself. And so she went away happy because what we worked on had nothing to do with her weight or her self-image. But anyway, about, I don't know, a few weeks later, she called me all in a panic, and she said, I have to see you right away. And I said, well, what's going on? And she says, I'm gaining weight like crazy. And I said, really? And she says, yeah. She says, I'm craving peanuts. I can't get enough peanuts. She says, I don't know what's going on with me, but she says, I'm going to the store and buying several of those gigantic jars of peanuts and loading them down. And I thought, well, that's really weird. And so we started talking about this, and I said, well, when did you start craving peanuts? And she said, well, it was about maybe 3-4 weeks ago. And I said, what happened then? And she proceeded to tell me that she was in the process of changing jobs. And her last paycheck was supposed to come in direct deposit like it always did. But something had happened that delayed it. And in the meantime, she was writing checks against this money. And, of course, her checks were bouncing. And she was panicking because she was racking up all of these bounced check charges, and she was having some financial issues anyway. And she says it was about that time that all those checks started bouncing, and I started craving peanuts. And I said, well, we need to take a look at the peanuts. Like, what do peanuts mean to you? She says, nothing. She said, I don't even like peanuts because I only eat them when there's beer. And I said, oh. So I said, well, when you were a kid, were you ever rewarded with peanuts? No. Well, did your family ever serve peanuts at special celebrations? No. So I kept asking her all these questions about peanuts, and nothing was resonating with this. And then finally I said, did you ever hear anybody say anything about peanuts? And she gets this look on her face, and she was absolutely horrified, and she said, oh, my gosh. She said, I used to sit around the dining room table at night and listen to my dad complain about working for peanuts. And she said, you don't think I believe that peanuts and money are the same thing? Well, she did. She believed that money equaled peanuts. And so her subconscious mind was saying, well, you need money. Just go eat some more peanuts. So when we...
That's an amazing story, Judy.
I know.
But is there ever a situation where Psych-K doesn't work, though?
Well, it doesn't not work, but what you encounter is resistance. Because if somebody really doesn't want to change, they're not going to, no matter what. Because there's this little thing called, in Psych-K, it's secondary gains. With EFT, it's called tail enders. And what those are, they're big yes buts. And it's really when a person is more vested in staying the way they are than changing. And I can tell another story about a lady who came to me, and this is a classic case of tail enders and secondary gains, and that was that this happened, another state in a faraway time, not so far away, but about 10 years ago, her daughter had been kidnapped and presumed murdered because nobody ever found the body. And so for 10 years, the family was just in limbo, wondering what had happened to the woman. And during this time, the woman had built her daughter into some sort of sainthood, had really, the minute someone has died or is gone, we tend to, forget all about their faults and what have you. And she had really spun a scenario about her daughter that really wasn't true. But she didn't know that it wasn't true. This is just what she thought about it. And then an interesting thing happened. This was now a cold case, and nobody was even investigating it anymore. And then the property, there was a property that was sold, that it was like an old abandoned farm or something, and it sold. And the new owners went out there and was cleaning off the property, and there was a wood pile out there. And in the process of cleaning out this wood pile, they found the skeleton of this young woman. And so the whole thing got dredged back up again. They had to go through the whole trauma again. And it turns out that the roommate had something to do with this. And during the trial, there was a lot of ugly testimony that came up about drugs and prostitution and all sorts of ugly things. And the mother became so distraught that during the middle of this trial, she lost her hearing. And she went to the doctor, and the doctor said there's absolutely nothing wrong with your hearing. So what the doctor said was that she was having a classic case of hysterical deafness. And he said the whole thing was emotionally caused. And so when she came to me, that's what I determined also, that it was emotionally caused. But what we also discovered was that really, sincerely, she didn't want to give up the deafness. She wanted to keep her deafness as a protective mechanism because the family was very religious. And as the details of this trial unfolded, the family started attacking her and blaming her about the way she raised this girl, attacking her on all fronts about a lot of things, and she was having difficulty anyway, of course, processing this whole thing all over again, but having her family attack her and also say really awful things about her daughter, she decided that she was better off staying deaf. And so that's indeed what happened. She chose to stay deaf. Now, whether or not this was conscious or unconscious, that was the result of it. And that's a classic case of secondary gain, where it was actually better for her, she thought, to stay deaf than to have her hearing restored. So that's just a classic case of what I was talking about previously.
So, Judy, can you ever release a condition or situation without really knowing what the underlying cause of it is?
Absolutely, and that's the nice thing about this, is that, sometimes we simply can't get to the underlying cause of it. And the lovely part of it is that we can muscle test and say, do we really need to know more about this particular situation to release it? And if the subconscious says no, then we can do a balance that says, I unconditionally releases whatever it is, regardless of the cause. And because the subconscious knows what the cause is. We just don't know what it is in the subconscious mind. And there was a really good illustration of this, ironically, with my daughter's boyfriend. And she stopped by my office one time, and we were chit-chatting about something, and her boyfriend came along with her. And during this conversation, she said, "Can you do anything with his eyes?" And I said, "Well, what's the matter with his eyes?" Well, ever since we had known him, he had this redness around his eyes. You know how your eyes get really red when you've been rubbing your eyes a lot. And it was a skin irritation. It wasn't in his eyes itself. It was around the eyes, this redness. And over the years, he had been to dermatologists, and they said it was everything from rashes to eczema to bug bites, I don't know what. And he had put every cream and lotion imaginable on it, and it had never made any difference. And he was an airline pilot. And he said, this irritation around my eyes really bothers me, particularly when I fly. And maybe it's something about my glasses, I don't know. But he said, I really want to get rid of this. Well, anytime we have a physical condition, the very first thing I ask is the primary cause of this physical, or is it emotional? And if somebody comes up with the answer, it's physical, then I'm sending them straight away to the doctor. But when we get an emotional answer, then the next thing to do is to start probing for what emotion or emotions are driving this or causing it. So we started the muscle testing routine, and I had said to him, I said, how long have you had this? And he said, as long as I can remember. This started when I was in grade school. Well, that's interesting. So we started muscle testing, and I started mentioning all sorts of emotions. And interestingly enough, I got a hit on grief. And I said, well, we're getting a positive here that your subconscious is telling us that grief is the underlying cause of this redness around your eyes, which kind of made sense because the body works in metaphors, and his eyes look like he'd been rubbing them. That's what they look like. They were red and irritated. So I started questioning him, and I said, well, did you ever lose anything when you were really young that you would be grieving over? And he says, not that I can remember. And I said, well, did you lose a pet or a favorite toy, or did someone in the family die or something? And he says, no, I can't remember a single thing. And so we decided to call his mother, and we asked his mother, we said, do you remember any time when he lost something and was very sad about it when he was a child? She says, no, I can't think of a single thing. And so we said, well, all right, so much for that. So the next question I asked in the muscle testing was, are we able to release this redness condition without really knowing the cause of it? And the answer was yes. So at that point, I said, all right, so we did a release on this. And they stayed in my office for maybe another 15 minutes. And before they left, my daughter said, Mom, his eyes don't look so red anymore. Now, normally we don't get an immediate reaction, but in this particular time we did. And sure enough, his eyes were less red. So they left, and they went. His mother lived in a nearby town, and so they went to his mother's house, and he walked in the door, and the first thing his mother said was, your eyes aren't red. And he went running to the mirror, and sure enough, the redness was gone. Now, we don't know why it left. It was just there, and we know that he was grieving over something, and we released it. And he called me about 2 weeks later, and he said, I don't know what to say. He said, this is the first time in my life, and I can remember not having this redness and this irritation around my eyes. And he said, it is absolutely gone. So we never knew what caused it, but we were able to release it. So if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, too, because obviously I guess he never did figure out, or no one ever really did figure out what the cause of this was. But I guess it didn't really matter. Judy, you keep talking about emotions, all about the emotions. Right. What about the emotion code? What is it, and what can it do?
Well, that's a whole different story as well. The emotion code is probably the newest of these modalities, although it's been around again for a lot of years. It's a technique that was developed by Dr. Bradley Nelson, who is a chiropractor and a craniopath over in Utah. And it really took him 21 years to figure this whole thing out. And it came about because he had patients coming to him that the doctors were saying there's absolutely nothing physically wrong with you. They'd had x-rays, they'd had tests, they'd had what have you, and yet they were having some kind of terrible physical condition or pain or whatever. So Dr. Nelson says there's got to be more of this, and he started exploring this. And he discovered that when we go through life, we experience all kinds of things, and it's no big surprise here. We oftentimes stuff our emotions. We don't handle them at the time, and it's kind of the old Scarlett O'Hara thing, I'll think about that tomorrow, and we stuff it away somewhere. Well, he discovered that when you stuff your emotions like that it can go into the body as a negative energy field, and it can settle around anything, like a joint or a muscle or an organ. And if it stays there long enough, it can cause physical discomfort or even, an injury. And so he started experimenting with that, and he discovered a very interesting process that this is buried in the body, and this is something that Psyche does not do, because this works on the cellular level of the body, whereas Psyche works with the subconscious mind, as does EFT. This technique actually works on the cellular level of the body. And he discovered that through muscle testing that if we could identify what a trapped emotion, what was trapped in there, that we could release it. And so the way we do that is to use his chart. He came up with a chart, and there's 60 emotions listed on that chart. Now, we don't have to test for 60 emotions every single time. We'd be there forever. So we divide, it's all divided in little boxes, and so we ask, is this trapped emotion in column A, or is it in column B? Is it an even row, or is it an odd row? And that narrows down the boxes. And the subconscious mind will identify, well, it's okay, let's say that it's in box B5. So we muscle test for the 5 emotions that are in box B5, and one of them will come up, and maybe it will say it's conflict or whatever it is. So the next thing we have to ask is, okay, when was this trapped? And we take the person's age, and we divide it in half, and we say, okay, if the person's 40, we say, did this happen before the age of 20 or after the age of 20? And we pinpoint the year as closely as we can, because the subconscious doesn't keep track of time the same way we do, but it's within a time frame, like within plus or minus a year. So once we determine what age this was trapped, the next process is to find out where it's trapped in the body. And this is where it gets really interesting, because I will go through a series of questions. Is this trapped on the front of the body or the back, above the waist or below the waist, and then start trying to narrow it down as to where it's trapped. Like, is it between the waist and the shoulders? Is it in the neck, in the head, what have you? And so it will identify where this is. And so doing muscle testing again, I will have the person hold their arm steady, and then I will run my fingers through that person's energy field. And when I hit that negative emotion, their arm will drop. And it's the first time that happened, I was so surprised because I didn't really expect that to happen, but that's what happens. When you find that negative energy, your arm drops. So the way that we take care of this is that this trapped emotion tends to want its little 5 seconds in the sun or something, because it brings it to the surface. When we identify what it is, it comes to the surface, where we then neutralize it, interestingly enough, with a magnet. And we don't run the magnet over the body part where this is trapped. If it's trapped in your arm, we're not going to run the magnet there. We're going to run it down your back, which is where all the nerve endings come together anyway in your spinal column. So we run this magnet down the back. And then we test again to make sure we release this trapped emotion. And then this time your arm will stay strong. And we keep doing that until we finish for the day, because this is emotional detoxing. And the subconscious mind will only let us release maybe on average of 8 to 10 things at a time. And then because it can overload the system, then the subconscious mind says, okay, we're done, because when I muscle test again and say, is there another trapped emotion we can release now? The answer is no. And when I ask, is there another trapped emotion, or are we finished releasing trapped emotions for the day, the subconscious mind says yes. And so I know that we are finished with that. And the whole principle of the magnet is this, that it's like neutralizing one form of energy with another. Because if you've ever gotten your credit cards next to a magnet, it wipes out your credit cards. And the same thing with your computer. The last thing you ever want near your hard drive is a magnet, because it'll wipe it out. So that's the principle behind the whole thing. You can also have what we call a heart wall. And a heart wall is actually not in the body. It's outside of the body. And basically it is an energy field that we put around ourselves to protect ourselves from being hurt. And a heart wall can really affect us negatively in terms of relationships and even prosperity, because it's like when you've got a heart wall, it's like being in a room with dirty windows and the blinds drawn, and the sunlight is getting in there, but it's sort of weak and filtering in, very, very little. So when we get rid of the heart wall, it's like we wash the windows, we threw open the drapes, and now the sun is coming in brightly. And so what happens is that people start reacting differently to other people. When you have a big heart wall, you tend to feel isolated from other people. You can be in a crowd of 500 people and feel lonely when you have a big heart wall. And the more traumatic someone's life has been, the more likely they are to have a heart wall. But the interesting thing is that not everybody has a heart wall, because there's a certain percentage of people who don't have one at all, and I've run across them. So it's not just a guarantee that we have a heart wall. But to illustrate how we can use this to release physical conditions, I would use myself as an example of that. So I'll tell a story about myself. Because the year that I learned to use the emotion code, that year after Christmas, for who knows what reason, I developed a severe pain in my tailbone. Now, when I was much younger, when I was in my 20s and I was going to college, I had fallen down a set of concrete stairs at my college and really hurt myself, but I never really had my back x-rayed or anything else, but, went on through life, and I had skiing accidents where I landed on my tailbone too, but nothing in recent memory had happened, and this pain just appeared out of the blue for no good reason that I could determine. And it kept getting worse and worse. And no matter what I did, that pain did not let up. So I had my back x-rayed, and they said, there's nothing wrong with you. And I went to my chiropractor, and she said, there's nothing wrong with you. And here I have this really bad pain in my tailbone. And over the months, it kept getting worse. I had a hard time driving my car because it hurt to sit on the seat. I couldn't sit through a movie because it hurt. I had to have a special chair at my office because it hurt, and this is just going on forever. And I'm living on pain pills, and I said, I can't live on bottles of Tylenol. This is ridiculous. Well, as it turned out, in May that year, that was the one and only time that Dr. Nelson came to Denver. And since I'm, 75 miles from Denver, I said, well, okay, I guess I'll go and take this training. So I did. And during this training session, Dr. Nelson said, does anybody have anything they want to get rid of? And I said, oh, that would be me. And he said, what do you want to get rid of? And I said, literally a pain in the butt. And after we got through laughing, he said, okay, fine. And so he says, we have a trapped emotion. Well, I was so new to this at that time that I really didn't know what he was doing particularly. I mean, I knew what he was doing. I just didn't hear what he said or what was trapped. And he did it so quickly, and he ran that magnet so quickly that I was just, not aware of what he did. And so I didn't notice an immediate relief from that pain. What I did notice was that I was able to sit more comfortably for the rest of the training session, but there was no letting up of that pain right away. So what happened was that about 3 weeks later, I suddenly woke up one morning and realized something was different. And the pain was gone. It came it went away just as fast as it came. And who knows what happened about that other than the emotion code. That was the only thing that had been different that I had done. And so the pain came for no reason, and it went for no reason as far as I was concerned, and the difference was the emotion code.
So that was the connection for you then. You really believed that it was the emotion code that made that difference, even though it took the 3 weeks.
Exactly. So we don't always get an immediate result. Because for me, it was 3 weeks. I would love it if I could just wave a wand over people and say, okay, now you're fixed. But that doesn't happen. And so in my particular case, it was 3 weeks. So that's basically how the emotion code works.
So Judy, all of these then, how do you use these, and how are these different modalities used in the course that you've written? Well,
what I use when someone is seeing me is whatever I feel is going to be the most helpful at the moment. Like if they're, like I said, emotional, I will use emotional freedom technique or EFT. But if we're into the belief systems, then I'm going to switch to Psych K right away and probably the emotion code. But in my course that I wrote, again, we were talking about what people they don't know what they want out of life. They don't really know what they believe. And so the course is designed to identify negative beliefs in 9 or 10 different areas of your life. And there's a huge questionnaire there. And people write down what they believe their belief is. And so then when they have their one-on-one consultation with me, we go through those beliefs to find out, if this really is what you believe. And then I will use Psych K to help them change that belief from a negative to a positive. And the whole course is kind of based on Psych K for that reason.
So it's pretty much based on Psych K, but you do use the other modalities pretty freely then as well, and kind of just match it up to whatever the person is.
Exactly. Like in a single session, I might use all 3 things, depending on what's going on with somebody. And I can also muscle test.
How can people get information about your course, Judy?
Oh, it's on my website. I have a website called limitlessliving.org. And all about the course is on there, and who should take it, who shouldn't. There's a whole Q&A section, and it gives all the details.
On your website, Judy, do you also have information about these different modalities like the EFT, the Psych K, and as well the emotion code, and the websites, the links for those as well?
No, the descriptions of the modalities that I use is on my those are on my other website, which is www.stressfreewitheft.com. And that's where I have some videos that the people who actually created these things are talking. Like we have Gary Craig on there, we have Rob Williams on there, and we have Dr. Nelson on there talking about how they came up with this and more about it.
Judy, when I'm listening to all of this, and when you're talking about this, you mentioned Gary Craig, who's the founder of EFT. Mm-hmm. Are there imitations out there? And should people be wary? Because I know you yourself have had a lot of training in these different modalities, mm-hmm. but I think people need to be aware, don't they, that not everybody can be doing this type of work with people.
Well, I don't know if there's any phony versions of it, because there's lots of versions of tapping, and they're called different things, and they're all effective if they're used right. But that's the operational word, if they're used right, because EFT is particularly effective in the moment. Like if you're really angry about something or you're feeling really sad, it's a wonderful way to tap yourself down. And I myself had to use that, I think, I talked to you about this sometime, and we were talking about my friend who died several years ago, and her family wanted me to speak at her funeral. And we had been friends for years and years and years, and I just didn't know how I was going to get through that funeral without melting down into a puddle. And so I tapped on that pretty much off and on the whole day about the sadness that I felt and, you know, all the emotions that were coming up with me so I could get through that funeral. So it's a wonderful tool, like, you know, if you're driving in the car and somebody cuts you off and you're really angry about it, rather than going into road rage, it's easier to tap on it. But
do keep your hands on the wheel, too. You can tap, but you still got to keep your hands on the wheel while you're driving, right?
Well, but you can tap with one hand or two hands. It doesn't really make any difference. You can tap with both of them or one, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
With the EFT, then, is this something, Judy, that people can pretty much learn to do for themselves fairly quickly?
Yes, people can learn to use it for themselves. But what I was going to say was that if you're trying to dig out childhood traumas and things like that, or to heal, you know, traumatic things from the past, you really need to have somebody work with you. Because if you're unskilled about it, you don't know what to get to. Because there's something called aspects with EFT, and they're like tree branches. There are things that are related to a core issue but are not the real things. And so you can tap on the aspects for a long time and not get to the core issue, which was like tapping on the tree branches and not getting the tree trunk. And until you can get to the tree trunk, nothing's going to happen, because we might be able to get some of the intensity out of it, but until we hit the real issue, we're not going to be able to collapse it. And that's where people really kind of need someone to help them to clear up things like that, because what we think is really the problem and what really is the problem are very oftentimes two different things. And I can give an example of that, because people will say, well, EFT didn't work for me. Well, the most common reason it doesn't work is because you're not tapping on the right thing. And we have to keep digging under and digging under and digging under to find out what is at the bottom of this whole thing. And I can give you an illustration of that, because 2 or 3 years ago, I was asked to do an EFT demonstration for a group of people in a nearby town, and there were about 25 people there, and I went through my little drill, and I said, well, does anybody want to be a volunteer here to get rid of something? And this very nice lady raised her hand and said, yes, I do. And I said, what is it? And she says, well, I'm really angry. Okay, well, when somebody says angry to me, I know that there's something underneath the anger, because anger is a secondary emotion, and there's something causing the anger. Something happens first, and then we get angry. And the two main reasons for anger is deep hurt or fear. So we have to keep that in mind. So I asked this lady what she was so angry about, and she was telling me about her community, because they lived in a little town that was sort of an isolated little community out in the country. And everybody out there really loved their little neighborhood. They were a tight-knit little community, and everybody had fixed up their yards and their homes, and they were just pleased. Then a developer came around and proceeded to start plowing up the property that was immediately across the road from this little community. And he literally made moon craters over there, and then proceeded to run out of money and left this place just a mess. And then the spring winds came up and started blowing this dirt around. And it was blowing dirt over their yards, and it was filtering into their windows, and they were eating dirt in their sandwiches and everything else. And the committee was absolutely livid about this. And the developer said, well, too bad, so sad, you're just going to have to live with it, because I don't have any money and I can't fix this. So this woman was absolutely furious at this developer. So we tapped on this, and we tapped about her anger at the developer, which was at a full-blown 10. And we tapped on this a few rounds, and she didn't come down more than about 3 points. Well, if you don't know what you're doing, you'd be discouraged by that. And so that was a clue to me that says, all right, that's a red flag to me that says we're not tapping on the right thing. So I asked her some more questions, and basically I said, what are you really angry about? Yes, you're really angry at this developer. That's a given. but what's underneath that? Why are you really angry? And she says, because it's out of our control. She says, we're afraid that our whole community is going to be ruined, and we can't do anything about it. And so when we started tapping on, being angry because she was out of control, it was really the feeling of being out of control that was the key issue here. And once we tapped on that, her whole issue just went away. Now, that didn't fix the neighborhood, and it didn't fix the community, but it neutralized how she felt about it. And this is what we do with this, is that this is why it's a stress management tool, is because we can't change one single thing of anything that's happened. But what we can do is change how we react to it. And that's exactly what we did, because, after that, she wasn't in touch with her anger so much. And that was the whole purpose of the whole thing, is that we got it out of her face so it wasn't bugging her so bad. Now, they were going to take steps, for the developer and everything else, but that had nothing to do with what we were tapping on, and we accomplished what she wanted, which was to neutralize that anger. And it's a classic case of what we call daisy chaining, because, you go from one thing to the other, to the other, to the other, and where you end up with is nowhere near where you started out. It's kind of like, remember that old game we used to play called Gossip, where, you said something in somebody's ear and they pass it around the room, and the last person who heard it, it wasn't even remotely the same thing. And this is that's what it is. It's kind of like a daisy chaining effect. So that's a basic summary of the kind of work that I do, and just a little, bird's eye view of each of these modalities. And so I want to thank all of you for being with us today. It was great to have you with us, and I invite you to come back next week when we're going to be talking about a totally different subject. And so thank you again for coming today, and have a great week. And I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
And again, I also want to thank everybody. And if they'd like more information, it's limitlesslivingtoday.com, as well as tune into this show each and every week. As well as if you'd like more information about me or my radio show, please visit my website at radioamericanow.com. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a fabulous week. And again, if you'd like to gain inner strength and empower yourself,